Welcome, one and all. This is Tristan McGough, your philosopher at large. And today, we're going to pull a little treasure out of Omni Philosophy, which is the 7 ideas of self. These are intuitional arrangements that we all have in our consciousness of what it means to be a self, the self, or self as a whole. However, before we begin, we want to remember what John Locke, the English philosopher, said that 90% of disagreement among philosophers, and for that matter, amongst any of us, is a disagreement over definition of terms. In other words, if we get our terms right, if we have these connotations, these meanings that we all refer to in common, like a dictionary definition, which is what a standard, canonical, categorized connotation is, that is, a defined meaning. If we do that, we're going to clear up a lot of our disagreements in discourse. However, most of us don't do that. And today we're going to be discussing the self, but before we do, we're not talking about just myself or yourself or the self or a self. You're going to see that these intuitional arrangements of consciousness, these pristine ideas, are the very foundation by which we interpret, we understand, we experience, and we utilize the world all around us. So before we embark on that, let me explain what the self is not in these arrangements. Nowhere is it given in any of these arrangements that the self is something discrete, that it's independent, it's permanent, it's absolute, it's without composed parts, that it's unproduced, that somehow the self is not produced, it's not composed of parts or elements, it's a independent, autonomous, distinct entity. This is not what I'm referring to as the self in any sense whatsoever. The self that we are going to be speaking of will include that personal sensibility of I-ness that we all have, and we say myself as opposed to yourself, or things that lack a self that may just in our minds be things. That is one of the intuitive arrangements. However, it's a reification. That is, it's a solidification of an idea into a fixed verbal form that doesn't necessarily hold. Because besides connotations, there are other ways that meaning arrives at its object. For instance, if there's a mother with 2 children, and you ask me, what is a mother? And I point at that mother with 2 children, I've given you a denotation, right? The word mother refers to what I'm pointing to. It's an ostensible definition. It's something that's established by me pointing to it and nothing else. It's much like an artistic depiction, like what I utilize in philosophic art. I'm pointing at an idea. That idea isn't there in that notation. So you may have a notation that says S-E-L-F, self. And somebody may say, well, what do you mean by the self? And so I'll give you a dictionary definition. That's the connotation. If I could point to a self like myself, which you would think that the body is at least a part of and a representation of, then I'm denoting that. However, as I'm utilizing that word self, you are re-noting. That is, you are establishing a fresh meaning in your consciousness at this very moment. which may take into account the connotations that you have of self. It may take into account the denotations that you've made of self. There's my mother, there's my father, their selves. There's my friend, there's my brother or sister, there's myself. They're selves other than me, but they're like myself. They're homologous. They have the same kind of structure or function or form. But besides all of that, besides there being a denotation, I can point to a mother, I can define a mother and connote her, and I can renote it by explaining to you now in brand new terminology what is a mother. But there is a whole depth of meanings that could be established. Even though Oxford may define mother in one way, Webster's Merriam may define it in a different way, utilize different words, but hopefully establish the same concept. However, when you look upon technical terms, and look up the self in an unabridged Webster's dictionary, perhaps the second or third international, you'll notice that there are categories of meaning, and then there are subcategories. It's not going to be the same in the Oxford Dictionary, but both of those are canonical, established, standardized meanings, connotations that we all can conventionally agree upon, no matter how they're worded. But below all of that, and why those particular terms were articulated at the surface level, only indicates that there's a deeper level in which things could have been said in an entirely different way. And that's what the nature of conversation, of course, is. We're always saying things in a fresh, different way. And we're pulling from this deep notation. All these possible notations that can be made. And if you think that's amazing, stop and think that the English language has only 26 letters in the alphabet. Out of that, I can make a page by arranging that alphabet in certain order. And if I want, I can make a whole book. And it's going to be unlike any other book that's ever been made. And if you go into a single library and you look upon the shelves and rows of books, they all have only 26 letters, and of course numbers, but 26 letters, elements, that went into the composition of that entire library. And now think, how many libraries are there across the world? Now stop and think. How many libraries have been lost the world over that's contained those 26 letters in different variations or the equivalent in other languages? It's amazing. So that all exists at the deep notational structure. So besides having just the connotation of what it is to be a self, and that's what I'm going to be dealing with here, right? I'm going to be dealing with 7 ideas I'm going to articulate, hopefully, enough to establish some connotation to what some of the philosophical artwork I'm going to utilize depict. So we're going to begin today with outlining these 7 intuitional ideas of self. And I'm going to give you just a brief summary. The reason being, the rest of this cycle of series of omniphilosophy is dealing with these 7 ideas. So Selfology 101 is your exposure today in an introduction to these 7 intuitional ideas, which we can easily represent as such. We begin with the omnos. The omnos is the all. It's the one and only, the single in soul, the all in everything of anything that's something, whether it is pure being, finite being, conscious being, or non-being. Anything you can throw into the hopper that has no circumference, it's not a reservoir, but anything that you could ascribe to the all and everything is what constitutes the self. That's the first intuitional idea of the self. What is it? It's a single, self-contained, all-pervasive, infinite, inexhaustible it. Now, you think for a moment about these intuitional ideas, and you're going to see that other people throughout the ages, and some of them quite modern, have discussed the self as omnos. For instance, let's take a look first of all at Parmenides, who was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. When it came to this all and everything, anything you could possibly imagine or possibly imagine as being a possibility, even an anti-possibility, thrown into this universal hopper, Parmenides said of it, it is. That's it. He represented it as, of course, a solid sphere. It is. But of course, that implies that there's a boundary. But when it comes to the all, that is, the self as the all, as omnos, it's best to remember what Rabelais said in Gargantua and Pantagruel when he defines God. He says, God is like an infinite crystalline intellectual sphere with its circumference nowhere and its center everywhere. Bertrand Russell, when speaking of the omnos, the self, as this all fundamental ground of being, said, the world may be called physical or mental or both or neither, as we please. In fact, the words serve no purpose. Well, the only purpose that any of these words are going to help is that we establish some kind of intuitive standing, that is, where we, every one of us, who have feelings and thoughts and wills and actions and a history and an expectancy, a faith that there is a future, all of us are engaged in this it, whatever it is. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's insignificant. That's why Kashmiraja in the Recognition Sutras speaks about this in his Sutra number 7. He says it is one, and yet it is two. It consists of three, has a quadruple being, and is 7, 5, and 7 times 5 in nature. In other words, you can divide this up in very many ways. And there is actually a tablature of tattvas, that is, of these categories, these fundamental taxons or categories that we can understand being and non-being and conscious being and finite being. We can understand what's going on through these categories. However, we shouldn't limit ourselves to just one category and say of the self as omnos that it's just one. Well, we can look at it again as always a duality. There's not just the actor, I'm watching my actions. It's the nature of consciousness. There's not only the object that you're beholding, right, but you're the subject that's beholding me, as I, the subject, am beholding this in front of me as my object. However, I have a projected imaginal object of who I'm addressing, and that is part of a deeper level of myself that relates to cognos, or to consciousness, experience. We'll touch upon that in a moment. So that's one way that we can view the self. And when we're talking about the self in that regard, very quickly, we're talking about not just the universe. The universe is all the cause and effect relationships we have with space-time entities around us. What defines a universe is that very causal network and structure. However, are there other universes that have their own causal networks, temporal structures, spatial dimensions that are, for all intents and purposes, self-contained, as their own cosmos, as their own self-contained self? Of course there are. We access the possibility of that through our imaginations, which again is part of our imaginal self. It's part of our feeling self. We're in contact with imaginary or possible worlds, and that's what they look at to us. It's like looking through a window of our consciousness, through consciousness, into the consciousness of another universe. Some will say it's mere imagination. But mere imagination of any given moment becomes tomorrow's actuality. Imagination is a stage to which an idea passes. It is not the once and only establishment of a reality through imagination, any more than when you intellectualize that you've crystallized some reality. And when I talk about some other multiverse, and that there are other universes, maybe homologous to ourselves, are quite different. We can say that's merely an exercise in speculation, and from our angle, indeed it is, but that is one of the imaginal faculties we have as well. That is, the ability to rearrange what we experience as actuality in other actual forms that to us are only possible. Nonetheless, there is the paraverse that undergirds them both. It is the foundational ground to anything that could ever be. It's unlimited, it's immense, it's complete, it's total, it is undividable, it is inexhaustible. Hurl as many multiverses as one could imagine to infinity, to the power of infinity, and it is not exhausted in its energy as pure, pristine, clear, moving, static, both together in an absolute still point which never changes, but yet undergirds, is the ground of all being. For without it, there could not be the unity that we have in any causal network at a universe's level, even in a local karmic level, unless there were a fundamental ground that establishes all of it, all at once, and yet itself is inexhaustible, as the next moment shows. It is never, ever exhausted out of whatever it is as omnos. So that is the paraverse. That's para-Brahman, as it's often spoken of. So we've dealt with the self as omnos, and I want to take a next look at the self then as the aeon, the one. We looked at omnos as the all, and for those of you who are familiar with Tantric Buddhism, particularly of the Tibetan variety, will note that I have notated that these are, in italics, references to the various Dhyani Buddhas. Dhyana Buddhas are Buddhas of pure meditation. That is, they're the still archetypes that once you attain to them, they are these intuitional ideas. The all-encompassing, that's the pristine cognition that naturally arises in all of us to regard the self as a self-contained unit. In fact, it can be the only thing that is a unit, the self, complete as it is as one, the all. However, we can also look upon the self as the one, because we make that transition from throwing everything into the hopper and saying that, yes, there is this ground of being, there is this ground of it, there is this ground of the omnos. But how does that ground come to be? Well, that ground is all at once, one. Whatever it is, whatever all of this is happening, the very fact of oneness shows in the unity of the causality of which we are experiencing. In the words, in culture, in the notes of music, in the rhythm of the wind, and the lack of rhythm in the rustling of the leaves. All of these things are part of one. And therefore we move to the next, and we consider the self as the aeon. And here the self has been referred to in many other terms by other individuals, particularly as ati or adi, perhaps as the Holland or the unitum or the antum. However, the old philosophic term for a study of the oneness of self is protology. The self is a singularity. And the methodology that we utilize for doing that, I have referred to as the omniversal model. And we've taken a look at that in the past in the self-transformation series. And here we're talking about that this particular universal model is something that applies to any unit, whether it's macrocosm, microcosm, or what the microcosm is composed of, that is the minicosm. And you can go down to the cellular level, you can go down to the atomic level, you can go down to the subatomic level. Whatever entity can be regarded as something which has some kind of distinct individuality, it can be explained and described by way of the universal model. And for everything that we're utilizing, I often refer to things by way of a template. And the template that I use is a meta-theoretic template. It goes across all categories and aspects. It's great for aspect modeling and the quinary hypothesis of self, where there are the 5 quintessential elements to self as intuition, willing, thinking, feeling, and doing. These 5 quintessential elements are related over and again through the meta-theoretic template, which as an octahedron is very convenient for either establishing 4 aspects, as are done on the plane of the system, or the basis and the event itself being an expansion of that very system. All of these we will explain bit by bit as we proceed into our future programs. And just to end on this note of the self as aeon, as an indivisible one, we look at the omniteric mode, that is, at the time that an individual is expanding their consciousness so that they have an enlightening mind, an endearing heart, a empowering will, and an emancipating life, At that time when they are making a transition and moving into happiness as a state of perdurance in their life, more so than any suffering, they're doing that as well by using this omniteric mode of the omniversal model. I call it the Om mode. And this is where, and you see me break it down over and again, this relates to various aspects of the individual self as being, of course, the thinking I represent as blue, the willing is green, the feeling as yellow, and activity doing as red. In regards to the self as the aeon, I do believe that I have a couple of quotes that I could share with you. If I could but find them. Let's see here. It might be here. Yes, indeedy do. It is. All right. First of all, we're going to take it from Sri Yukteswar, and he opens his holy science. His very first sutra says, Para Brahman, or God, the ground, that great expanse, is infinite, complete, without start or end. It is one undividable whole. It is one undividable being. It is that undividability of being which is the very nature of the Paraverse and Parabrahman. It is the nature of something as a singularity. And that is why Heraclitus, again, a pre-Socratic, came before Socrates there in Greece. He says, not on my authority, but on that of truth, it is wise for you to accept the fact that all things are one. So, once again, this great non-receptacle or hopper, this ontological hopper in which you could throw things into as the self as the omnos and say, well, it's got to include this and it's got to include that. I mean, if I can think of it, it's the imaginings and everything else. Well, that all gets conveniently wrapped into that dimensionalist point, the aeon. The aeon itself, the one will, whole and complete in itself, says D.T. Suzuki. The self is aeon. The one will, whole and complete in itself, is now at once actor and observer. This is the nature of consciousness. Not only is it clear and does it continue, there's a continuum, but the nature of consciousness is that as it unfolds, that unfolding itself is an action. And the action itself is the action of light, of consciousness, of knowing. You see, we'll get to that in just a short moment here when we consider the self in another dimension. So, that is the self as the aeon. Now we're going to deal with the self, the third aspect of the self. Put up our diagram here just again for a moment. We did the omnos and aeon. Now we're going to deal with reality. There's another intuition we all have, and that is, we go, well, you know what? Whatever the self is, it's real. It's the true. It's what is. Here, reality has been defined as separate in many different ways throughout the millennia. But here it's basically suchness, or it's the continuum. It's the way. It's the way things are. It's the nature of things. And ontology in philosophy and etiology are what study this. And I've used the various omniversal model, as well as I refer to it here as the metacrucis, and that's a way of pointing at and describing the very nature of change, and that is dealing with metamorphics. And here we're dealing with the crucis and the candida. That is, we're dealing with what are basically called cause and effect, and we're talking about how the moment generates the now from the eternal base it is at. Again, we will be dealing with that at a later time. But for the moment, let's just take something from a Christian mystic. And this is Heidevik. And Heidevik says the circle of the world embraces all things. Now, it embraces all things. And as Philip K. Dick says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. That's another great thought as to what the nature of reality must be. Even when I reflect, I'm always coming back from consciousness to itself. Even when I go to sleep or I don't pay attention to my thoughts in a mindful way, I come back to something that's endured. Albert Einstein says a human being is a part of the whole called by us the universe. Remember what Bertrand Russell was talking about. You can call it mind, you can call it matter, you can call it both or neither. A human being is part of the whole called by us a universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This affection for a few persons nearest to us, pardon me. All right, so as you say, Heidevik is talking about the circle of the world encompassing all things. Again, we have this idea of totality and the all, but the idea of singularity and of the one. And of particularity, it's embracing all things, but not just things. What about no thing? Well, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. Well, you know as well as I do that there are certain things that have come into your life and they've went away. They no longer exist in your life. Think of one of them. All right. You've gone back to it. It doesn't go away. Even nothingness has a way of staying around. We'll deal with that a little bit later. So now let's look at a quote from Albert Einstein, no less. A human being is part of the whole called by us universe. Now remember what Russell had said. He said you can call it whatever you want. Call it physical, mental, both or neither. Well, according to Einstein, a human being is part of the whole called by us the universe. A part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Now look what Heidevik said. The circle of the world embraces all things. Tantra is the process by which you expand your center to the omniverse. As incredible as that sounds, that doesn't mean that you behold all the limited particulars all at one time in a God's eye view. Not as long as you're in a body that has these separative senses. But these separative senses are the very magic that allows us a window into the infinite varieties of appearances and manifestations, these permutations and combinations of being interplaying with non-being that established for us this flow we call existence. So, that is our third view of the self. That view being the self as reality. It's what's real. Now we're going to look at, we're going to look at the four quadrants of a reality very quickly, because I've only alluded to it. And although we will treat it in greater depth during its episode, let us understand that there are four ingredients to reality. That's its recipe. And these four ingredients are quite simply pure being. There's got to be pure being. There's got to be something that connects the particular being of this to the particular being of this and the table and everything else. Just call it pure being, whatever it is. Give it any name you want. As Russell said, as Einstein said, we can call it the universe. Call it whatever you want. But there's that pure being. But that being is all broken up, isn't it, into almost fixated forms. We know they flow. Even at a subatomic level, everything is flowing. In our consciousness, everything is flowing. 10-dimensionals. We have feelings and thoughts and volitional dimensions. We have bodily dimensions with its various sensory inputs and its motor outputs. We have deeper levels of ourself, and this is all going on at once. This is all finite particulars. So we know we've got pure being. We know we've got particular or finite being. But you know what? We've also got this finite being that is here today and gone tomorrow. And what isn't here today may be coming tomorrow, so there's change. There's always change. Well, that change is nothing than non-being carving up being into its forms of finitude. We will deal with those aspects of non-being, but I'll give you very quickly what I'm speaking about. Just two types of non-being. One is called antecedent non-being, and the other is called annihilative non-being. Now, you know what annihilative non-being is. You've had a pet, you've had a loved one. When they're gone, their physical and their psychological constitution in that physical body, in this manifest plane of reality, is gone. It's annihilated. It's not coming back, ever. Nor is any word that has just expired ever coming back. I can reproduce it, but it's expired. It's done. It has annihilative asat. It is something that had a beginning. The moment my pet cat died is the moment annihilative beginning began for that particular cat. But you know what? That annihilative being goes on forever. It doesn't end. So that's the nature of annihilative non-being, or as I call it, annihilative asat. The other, antecedent asat, is this. Before birth of that kitty didn't exist. It had antecedent non-existence. That is, prior to it coming into being as a zygote in this world, it didn't exist. That kitty didn't exist. And the moment it did come into this world is the moment its antecedent non-being quit. It ended. Because now it exists. Before that, it didn't. That's its antecedent non-being. And this is the obverse of annihilative non-being, because you see, annihilative non-being, it's going to go on always. It had a start when something died, but it has no end. Now, antecedent non-being, on the other hand, had no beginning. There was never a time that cat didn't exist. But it did have an end, unlike annihilative non-being. So those are two aspects of non-being. And you can see, therefore, that in the intuitional idea of the self as a reality, we're looking at the self and saying, well, you know what? There's being, there's the finite being, and then there's the way that finite being gets carved up. So as one moment it is not, and the next moment it is, and the next moment it is not. But the self that's considering all of this about the self happens to be a conscious being. You and I are conscious beings. And not only arguably, but actually, conscious beinghood extends to anything that has sentience, intelligence, vivacious, that is, living energy, and conscience. That is a sense of coherency of oneself, whether as a preservational unit or as a unit that is progressing into the future because of a self-reflective capacity which we humans have. So, 4 ingredients in the recipe of reality: pure being, finite being, conscious being, and non-being. You need all 4. And it's no good trying to reduce one to the other. It's never going to work. And if you were to say to me, well, now, let's look in terms of philosophical analysis, how can you even say such a thing that conscious being is a fundamental of existence, anything that exists or of reality? Well, how can you say that energy is? Somebody tell me what energy is. That's just considered a basic term. The capacity to do work? Really? Well, that sounds sort of circuitous, because that's exactly what we're talking about. Or is it like Whitehead said, being is that which has the potential to be. In other words, that's its very nature. To be is to be able to be something at its most fundamental, potentiated level, is it not? And here we're dealing, in terms of the ontology of the EN, we're looking at the one in terms of even that one. Remember, right? It has a quadruple, fourfold being, as it says in the Recognition Sutras. This is one way to look at it, one way to divide it up. However, these are indispensable taxa, or categories. They are the 4 ingredients of reality. Reality is composed of all of those at any given moment. So let's pass on to the next intuitive idea of self. We've dealt with the self as the all, the one, and the real. Now we're going to deal with it as the whole. Now, as the whole, we just talked about the ontology of the aeon. The ontology of the aeon presupposes several things. It supposes, first of all, that this entire cosmos that we have is really a set in a series of cosms, that is, of units, whether it's the macrocosm, the microcosm, or the minicosm. All of it has these aspects of willing, thinking, doing, you call it energy, and willing. You can call that the motive impulse or force, if you like. Actually, we will deal more in depth with the principles of cosmization. That is, how does something become a unit? How does an identity establish itself as an individuality so that it is a definable entity in the context of events, and it is capable of being experienced from the inside out as an episode, as conscious being. We'll deal with that at another time. However, suffice it to say, for the moment, that there is a certain ontography to the universe. Now, forget the paraverse, forget the multiverse, just focus on the universe. Scientists are prone to embrace naturalism or a form of physicalism and say everything is essentially material, or at least energetic. And I totally agree. In ancient yogic philosophy, established the Sankhya philosophy, which enumerates 25 elements to reality. That's called Prakriti. It's nature. According to esoteric science, theosophy, ancient Indian cosmology, continuing lineages of Abhidharma, that is, of the metaphysical understanding of the universe we live in, always stratifies the various levels of matter of Prakriti. And these are its various manifestations. And here are the planes of Ausya, and that is of the being that we're talking about. This is pure being, infinite being, eventually becoming physical through its various gradations, if you will. There is a corresponding ideations of parousia. Parousia is being born again. It's being aware of itself. It's human being become divine being. That is, you've expanded the aperture of your understanding to embrace the cosmos. And this is done from where you sit as a point, which has dimensionless and therefore infinite potentiality. All of it becomes stratified. And of course, I love using the octahedron as a kind of rupa or form in my philosophic artwork for explaining the various levels, although you could envision this as a sphere, stratified if you like, but the stratification only goes so far, because the greater always includes the lesser, which means that if you view it as a sphere, an infinite sphere, well, if it's infinite, that is, it's afinite, it doesn't have any limit. That's the paraverse, right? And the paraverse was something that we could represent as this. It's going out. There is no circumference. No, there's no center, there's no circumference. The multiverse are all the various universes, and they themselves are infinite. And so I'm not going to put an infinite set of little universes there. However, we have a universe. And in our universe, we could describe it much like this in terms of its ontography. We're going to map the universe and its pracritic or physical levels from the most rarefied to the most obvious and palpable here in 3D material form. Well, all we're taking is Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared. Energy, which is that pure being, equals matter, which is massified or solidified being, times light squared. Very simple. How elegant. And of course, it can be useful, and it has been useful, has it not, in science and applied science. However, is it true? When we're speaking about energy, and that somehow you arrive at energy by taking mass and multiplying it times light. Now, first of all, how do you multiply mass times light? What? You're going to speed it up to the speed of light? Wait a moment. The speed of light is 186,000 miles per second, right? That's the local limit established by Einstein. How do you square it then? How do you practically square light in order to somehow smash it against mass or speed mass up? Twice the speed of light? No. Speed of light, squared times the speed of light. It sounds like a lot of mathematical equilibriumization in order to account for the changes that occur. And it works as far as we agree on the different quanta and the different metrics that are being used, and they have a pragmatic value, and there are certain pragmatic values to understanding what it is from the strictly scientific limited point of view of saying, well, there's only these lower obvious dimensions which are here. The rubric dimensions are the dimensions we see, the solid, the liquid, the gas, as well as the plasmic, right? That is lightning, electricity, even the plasma that's sparking from in our brains, right? The fourth state of matter. But beyond that, the subatomic states of matter, which in esoteric science and in theosophy is called the etheric realm, again, a word, not to be confused with the ether that was debunked and now is gaining new coinage with the idea of entanglement, quantum entanglement. Regardless, scientists, modern materialistic, naturalistically oriented, physically prone, using mathematical statements to explain reality, though that mindset is confined just physically here to the finite levels. Beyond that are other states of matter, much finer than the subatomic, and have utterly different principles on which they operate. I'll refer only to one. When you fall asleep and you're in your dream world, where are you? You're occupying some kind of space in consciousness. Are you not? This is your imaginal space. This is the space where all of a sudden you turn in a room and the scene completely changes. How did that happen? Did it really change, or did it only change in your mind, in your imagination? Well, news for you. The imagination is composed of something. It is some kind of being at whatever level. It has a cause and effect relationship on that level. That's why you are able to change scenes so rapidly, because its causality is not the sequential causality that we have interpreted this manifest world by, and which we analyze it by. Doesn't mean that that's all that's going on in the world at this moment is lineality, right? There can also be concentricity, and there also can be expansiveness at different levels that are occurring right at this very moment. None of it is excluded. Some of it's concealed, some of it's revealed, particularly to finite beings. But we'll deal with that in greater detail later on. For now, we are going to move to our next level of self, another orderly arrangement of the intuition, which we are all able to comprehend, and that is cognos, the mind. And here we are dealing with the self as usually we understand it, because the self as we understand it is often defined in scientific terms by psychology. And psychology and different psychological schools will define our personal self in certain ways that we've come either to recognize or to accept as being part of this real world in which we live as conscious beings. So we're going to consider now cognos as the mind. Now remember this, the mind here is not the intellectual faculty. The mind, as it's often used in scientific as well as spiritual and scriptural and epistemological language, refers to consciousness. Consciousness is clear and knowing, right? And knowing is not the same thing as thinking or judging. That's just one way of knowing. Self intuits everything you're doing. You have an immediate intuition of it, and that is knowing. Knowing is direct. It is not indirect. When I have a sensory experience, I consider that it's direct perceptually. However, epistemologically, I am interpreting whatever has touched my retina in terms of perception, or my eardrums in terms of hearing, or my skin in terms of touch, etc. You understand what I'm talking about with that. Nevertheless, when I am willing something, I know what it is I willed. In fact, we're always correcting people, and they say, don't tell me what I believe. I know what I believe. That is, you intuit directly. You have a knowledge that nobody else has. Immediate, direct, instantaneous, complete, sufficient. Not just adequate and sort of. It's certain. It's apodictic. It's self-evidentiary in your consciousness. You know when you're having a bad feeling. You know when you're depressed. You know when you're sad. You know when you're happy. Those are all feelings. Knowing. You know you have feelings. These are your intuitions. When you know you have your willings, again, intuitions. When you know you have your thoughts, you say, yeah, I remember thinking about that just yesterday. That's you, as an intuitive entity, seeing directly what your thinkings were. Thinking is where judgments happen. Intuiting doesn't need a judgment. Intuiting is instantaneous. It's spontaneous. It's always 100% accurate. We may conceal what we intuitively know, what we self-reflectively know to ourselves, by not reflecting that through our mind, or trying to suppress this feeling, or trying not to do anything that's going to be associated with it. But still it's there. The nature of the self, as psychologists deal with it, has to be broadened. It has to be expanded to take into account the complete constitution of the human being that goes through all those various planes, all of those planes, all the way from the most rarefied senses of intuition, all the way down to the concrete aspects of tactile sensation, palpability. It's all about experience. And what we will be dealing with in the session on the self as cognos, as the conscious being, is experience, where you have the experiencer, who's the knower, you have the experiencing, which is the knowing, and you have the object of experience, which is the known. As well as in terms of cognos, we'll deal with the 10-dimensional self. Now, we're all familiar with the bodily self, our living dimension. We have the various sensory inputs, and we have the motor outputs, and categorize these as we like. We know very well what our living dimension is, and that's our bodily self. Now, there's also something else called a feeling self. We have an emotional self. We have that part of us that has desires, feelings, preferences, affects, passions, all the things that we may try to think about and analyze. However, feeling them is something entirely different, right? And here's where you have a fifth kind of meaning that takes place. I can point to a mother. I can define a mother by the dictionary definition and give you a connotation of what a mother is. You can have a renotation and sit there and think of, yes, of all the mothers I've had, I know exactly what he's referring to. So you have a new sense of what I'm noting at that moment, or notating technically. And that all comes from the deep notation. But I have a very personal meaning of mother, right? That's the mother I had. That is that deep personal intuition that I have of having a feeling of having experienced this individual being my mother and what she did and what I remember her doing and what she continues to do within inside of me all these years later. Wow. That's a very deep level of meaning. That's a personal notation. That's not something that anybody else will have. And you have the same thing with your mother. You have the same thing with your father. You have the same thing with every individual you've ever met. You have a personal notation. And that personal notation consists partly of feelings, but it also consists of your thoughts. You have this narrating self. Have you noticed that? Where you'll be talking to yourself internally. That's your narrating self. And actually, it's your thinking dimension. And that's one of the 10 which you have. You have a willing dimension as well. There are sometimes you say to yourself, I shouldn't think about that, and change your line of thought. That's willpower. That's nothing to do with feelings. You can feel now a different way, particularly if you turn your attention to, for instance, let's say, a gorgeous painting, and you become so absorbed in that painting that now you have a feeling of beauty. And you've forgotten all about what it was that you might have been feeling before or even narrating to yourself. And that's due to your willing dimension or your volitional self. But I've referred earlier to imagination and its power, if you will, for invoking the multiverse, if not directly perceiving it. Regardless, that's what we're always doing with others as well. There's a social self in which we are always invoking relationship between the thou and the I. And this dimensionality is extremely deep because it is not just the image I have of you, it's the image I have of myself, and then the image I have of how you may see me, or the image of how I think you'll see me if I do such and such, or if I did such and such. You see, there are all these complicated ramifications that happen within in this hall of mirrors of the social self. But yet all of everything we do happens within the alembic of your consciousness as a perspectival self. You have a certain point of view, and this is your observing dimension. You've taken the world from a way only you can. And I'm not talking about just in terms of your sight, which you can alter, or the sounds, which will change, or any other way that you can orient yourself in the physical world. You also come to the world with a unique perspective in terms of your sentiments, right? Your beliefs. The pledges you've made, the promises you keep, the commitments you've made, the vows you've taken, all these things, they all go in to a perspective that you have that is utterly unique in this universe of differences that are held together at a unitary level. And that brings us to your enduring self or your continuing self, where you keep waking up to yourself every morning. When you daydream, you come back to yourself. When you interrupt your thoughts and you call attention, well, there you are, again, as you reflect on yourself. And this is your enduring self, but more amazing is the unifying self that keeps it all together. Not only do you continue as this unified sense of self that goes on from day to day, the enduring self, but there's this unifying self that takes all of it, all your willings, your decisions, your judgments, your discernments, your understandings, your feelings, your thoughts, your sentiments, habits, dispositions, all of it, unifies it all. And then people often think that if they can look at this unified self, how you're uniquely put together in this unified way, that's going to actually discern your real self. But of course, all of these are part of your real self. So that organizing self with its unifying dimension also indicates that you have an advancing self, and this is your presenting dimension. Right in this very moment. It's an amazing moment, because at this moment, you have a temporal moment. You have the present as the presented. I'm presented by way of a set of images and sounds to you. At the same time, there's presentivity. That is, it's the very possibility and the property of presence. Because presencing is actually the actualization of being into becoming. There was always something that is being retended from the past as we protend to the future, as we intend now in terms of our subject-object perspectival relations. But in all of that, what is being presented is something always new. The presenting itself is something that's always a performance. It's always a taking of the energies that existed before, and through the series of causal concatenations of turning it into a result. That's what's happening here with every sentence that I utter, right? There's a beginning, we take it linearly, and then we end with a period at the end, and we move on. And there's somebody else who is not familiar with English, it sounds like it's all just incomprehensible, insensible sounds. They have no meaning. They're unintelligible. However, what we realize is through the freshness of each moment is that it is actually advancing. Because you could not have this present moment unless there was a preceding moment of consciousness with all it contains. And besides that, we talked about the superabundance of all the possibilities, for instance, of what 26 letters can be turned into, and what I've managed to turn the phonemes of these letters into during this last hour. All of that is part of the advancing self. Now, is the advancing self the same as the progressive self? Wait until we cover that. And then the final self is the one self. It's the identifying dimension. We'll treat that in a moment. However, I wanted to end by, when it comes to the self, just talking about we need an expanded sense of what the human constitution is. And not only are we a creature down here on this level of rupa, in this finite level, but as transfinite human beings that are able to take all these finite experiences and thread them like beads on the thread of consciousness, Chitta Santana, the stream of consciousness, which contains miraculously everything I've ever thought, never done, ever willed, ever experienced, and all of it keeps coming out fresh and spontaneous through a spontaneous presencing of conscious being. All of that is indicating that there are infinite dimensions that await us, but as transfinite beings, we realize that we are able to string so many of our finite experiences onto something that is transfinite, that contains them all, that we call ourself, each of us as cognos, as a cognos being. However, we do realize then, after we've went through and discussed what it is that the constitution of the human being includes, which are so many other things besides that we typically think of in terms of modern-day psychology that we need to address, and we will address those as we move along. But next, what we are going to discuss is the sixth idea of what the self is. This intuitional idea, or if you will, arrangement of consciousness, concerns what is the psychonaut or the pilgrim. In every single cultural tradition, whether it is the scientist who is moving as a novice into a higher level as an expert in their field so that they can probe the deeper dimensions of their discipline, or whether it is the religious monastic who decides that they will take a journey of themselves as one to the one and only, or whether it is the artist who starts off tagged, ragged, wishing for that vision or that inspiration, that muse will ignite the sparks of their creative cauldron so that they will be able to depict or to represent, establish or perform, compose or constitute what is something utterly new, novel. We're all on a journey. And here, self as cognos, as consciousness, as the experiencer, realizes, especially through the advancing self, that not only is it not alone, but it's involved in a series of changes. Now, these changes, they either lead to states of great functionability or dysfunctionability. But the self as psychonaut is the self basically who has the grit, gumption, and courage to keep going and to become a savior, first of all to themselves. They need to save themselves. Remember what Buddha said, be ye a refuge unto yourself. Christ in you, the hope of glory, says St. Paul. You have the capacity, and that's why Christ said, Yahshua, also called Jesus, but in the Aramaic it's Yahshua. That which I have done, ye shall do greater. Well, someone who was infinitely established could understand that other transfinite beings would be anchoring themselves in infinity if they climb Jacob's ladder, if they climb this ladder of evolutionary progress and opening up of the wisdom eye. And here this represents soteriology. That is, how is it that salvation or redemption, purification or transformation is possible? It is here that our last 12 session series entitled Seminar on Self dealt with in 12 parts self-transformation. Self-transformation here for the psychonaut is self-realization plus self-cultivation. And through that, you're going to go through your hierarchy of needs and numens, that is, things that have to be satisfied at a material level and things that have to be satisfied at a psychological and a higher level as a psychonaut. So here we're dealing with palingenesis, that is, the phoenix transformation of oneself through the experience of dying and being reborn. Unless you be born again, you cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. Those were the words of Yahshua. They've been repeated countless times by anyone who's went through the experience of awakening, which is your baptism. Let's, from Ram Dass of the Vedanta Hindu tradition, and a contemporary of ours, he says, human existence begins with the belief that we are separate, then moves on to trying to find our way back to the one. of which we are not just a part, but who, in fact, we are. Plotinus reminds us it's the flight of the alone to the alone. And here you can take the word alone, and it can mean all one as a cosm, to the all one as the macrocosm, microcosm to macrocosm. The secret of happiness, says Paramahansa Yogananda, is consciousness of the presence of God. And the presence of God are these presencing that we mentioned, with the presented object, the present moment. Presentivity is the property of this presentness now, and the actual presenting, which is the energetic dynamic action of things actually unfolding. All of this constitutes presencing. All of this is coming from the one single ground. And all of this we establish after we move past a net of niscience, that is our delusions, which have to do with our doubts and the diversions and the distractions and the desires that are always preoccupying us with finite exchanges that actually call upon us to forfeit our being, our conscious being, because we occupy ourselves with finite things. As Sartre said, consciousness borrows being. So if being, finite being, is always coming in at your consciousness with sounds and lights and this and that, the other thing, and people talking and cars beeping, you are forced as consciousness to take and borrow that being. And that's why we all sift through our filters, and that's why we don't hear most of what is said, and that's why we don't think of the connotations of what most people mean. And we'll take our own simple renotation and be content with that, however limited it might be. So we got to get past the net of niscience, and we move into the enlightening fields of the mind, but as well the expansive fields of the heart. And here we're dealing with moving from just the various experiencing that we have as human beings that involves being engaged in a dynamic material world, being entrained by certain thoughts, whether it's a poem or whether it's your own thinking or whether it's a movie you're watching, being endowed with certain capacities of will, being entertained, that is, being delighted with the things around you. We're always looking to satisfy our appetites. It's a appetite-driven world, is it not? Capitalism. It's an ideal place in order to promote desire and divestment and diversion and distraction and all the other things that stop us from really becoming concentrative and unitive and understanding the hidden power that we have to change virtually anything about ourselves. So there are axial paths to transformation by which we'll take that fundamental experience that we have, and instead of just expecting the same old, and being fixed to routines of existential living, we're going to move into the expanses of the Newmans, which are after you are awakening. That is, Maslow calls it self-actualization. Those are the levels above self-actualization. You have a need for the truth, and a need for beauty, and a need for goodness. These are things that you have needs of at a spiritual level, and that they do not awaken until there is a certain level of consciousness expansion, when you are able to balance your I with the thou, which is within your feeling apparatus. We'll speak more of that, of course, later on. And as I've already alluded to, the process of self-transformation includes realization and cultivation, so that leads to the final result. And in self-realization, you're basically looking to uncover, discover, and recover the 10 dimensions of yourself, of which we briefly touched upon earlier. The key to the uncovery is using the awakening mantra. I am conscious of being conscious. Those words themselves aren't going to make you conscious of being conscious. They're words, they're notations. However, if you renote them to yourself and have them per-noted, that's a personal notation, and you understand what it actually is to be conscious, such as you're conscious of my words. Well, now, are you conscious of being conscious of my words? That's your doorway. What you do through that doorway, you will determine. And that's why you want to meditate, because meditation gives you the power through techniques to keep that one pointed attention as you move through a moving environment and a mutable world. So, the things you realize, you're going to then cultivate those 10 dimensions through basically your 4 capacities. 5 if you include your intuitive capacity of self. And so you're eventually going to end up with serenity and bliss, etc. We'll deal with that. But in your waking consciousness, I'm conscious of being conscious. You are going to basically be calling upon your reflective consciousness. And you see, philosophic talk is designed to get at that intuitive consciousness, to get you to reflect. Because reflection in itself is an immediate awakening of yourself as a conscious being. You can continue that because you have a continuum. You have a continuing consciousness. And so therefore, you can have mindful thinking. You are mindful of everything that happens around you. You don't just, mindful thinking is not just being fixated to one thing in your head and then going, that's all I can think about. No, mindful thinking is being aware of everything that arises in thought, because every thought will arise and every thought will perish. Same thing with feelings. So when you have them, you have appreciative feelings. And this is a very big component because it's wonder, it's amazement, it's astonishment. It's opening up your heart to the beauty that's always being revealed within the world. So you have, besides mindful thinking, you have appreciative feeling. These are the capacities of awakening. Just as when you are focused in your acting and you are deliberate in your willing, these are all things that your reflective consciousness does as an awakened being. You will go through certain transformations of your consciousness and other things that you may have previously desired or preferred or defined or separated yourself from. You find that you've revised and transformed it, and as a psychonaut, that's exactly what you're doing. And as an awakening human being, you are going to develop on every single one of your levels. That is whether as a person, or as the psyche inside, or as the spirit, that is that self-conscious entity which is at the basis of both, whether it's spirit or soul or soma. These are integrated as one. You may identify along a line of identity more with your empiric self, your outside self, your personal self, than you do with your inner self. But that can change. And that does change, because there are times where you're completely ensconced within your own autocosm, your own mental world, your own inner scape rather than this outer scape. So there's a certain way to waking up. And once one has woken up and they see themselves as an integral aspect of being, and all being as integral to themselves, they become the perfected, or parousia. Now, parousia is the adept. It's expressed in the past by Chuang Tzu, in which he says, if having reached this human form is joyous, how much greater is the joy of knowing that after countless incarnations we can look forward to the infinite, accepting life as it comes. One can reach that source which lies behind all changing phenomenon. That's probably the best definition of parousia as one could give. Now, in the Nag Hammadi, which were 52 different books that were found, I think it was 1946, in the desert. In the Sophia of Jesus Christ, in this Gnostic Christianity, it says, whoever knows him in perfect knowledge will rest in him who has no beginning and no end. Well, that sounds a lot like Sri Yukteswar's first sutra, doesn't it? Without start or end. One undividable being. Undividable being, Yahshua, which we've come to call Jesus through a series of linguistic transformations in the process of translation. In the Aramaic, Yahshua said, I and my Father are one. Well, that's pretty unitive. In the Upanishads, I am Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. And, of course, we can't end with any better than the non-dualist Shaivite, Buddharaja, which was Kesamaraja's great guru, his guru's guru. The method of attaining the goal is to be constantly awake to one's own awareness. The method of attaining the goal is to be constantly awake to one's own awareness. By this means, the sage achieves the state free of differentiation. There is no other way other than staying with awareness of one's own being. By constantly maintaining this, the yogi will become joyful, resting in the self. So those are the 7 ideas encapsulated in this diagram for the moment. And the next time that we'll get together, we'll be talking about Omnos, the All, of which we treated briefly today. So, until the next time that we meet, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can. But above all else, be yourself. Thank you.